The mule stopped before Caleb did. Not at a cliff, not at a washout, not at a drift. On a flat white stretch of Wyoming trail, where the snow lay smooth as flour, and the road still ran clear beneath the runners. The old mule planted all 4 feet and refused to move another inch. Caleb Reed drew the reins tight. Juniper. The mule did not flick an ear. She stood with her head turned west, staring across the open basin as if someone had called her name from miles away. Caleb followed her gaze. At first he saw nothing worth fearing, a pale winter afternoon. Low sagebrush buried to the knees. A line of brown bluffs breaking the far side of the basin. Empty country in every direction. Then the light changed, not dimmed, changed. Along the western rim, a strip of darkness had begun to crawl under the clouds. Beneath it, loose snow lifted from the ground and ran sideways in silver ropes. The sky above stayed almost clean, but the earth itself was moving. Caleb lowered the reins. He had seen rain come over a ridge. He had seen thunderheads pile up black over the plains. This was different. This was not a storm falling from the sky. This was winter standing up from the ground, and it was coming fast. 5 days earlier, Caleb had left the rail siding outside Rawlins with a cracked hay rack, 2 sacks of oats, a torn canvas cover, and 1 mule too old for hard freight. He was meant to reach his brother's sheep camp before nightfall. But a broken runner, a wrong turn at a buried marker, and grief he had not yet learned how to carry had slowed every mile. His wife had died before the first hard frost. Since then, Caleb had been moving because stopping felt worse. Now the country had stopped. The first thing most men would have done was whip the animal forward and race the weather. The second thing was search the horizon for smoke, a roof, any sign of another human being. Caleb looked for neither. He looked for a place the wind could not pass through. The air went still. That was what frightened him most. No hiss through the sage, no creak from the harness, no small slap of canvas against the rack. The whole basin seemed to hold its breath. Caleb climbed down from the sled and put one hand on Juniper's neck. The mule's hide trembled beneath his palm. "All right," he whispered. "You heard it before I did." Then he turned toward the bluffs. From the trail, they looked useless. Not a cabin, not a cave. Just broken brown stone and a shallow draw where spring water had once cut into the earth. But Caleb had repaired sheep sheds, patched line cabins, and slept through enough prairie weather to know shelter was not always a building. Sometimes it was 3 sides, and a decision he led Juniper off the trail. The old mule resisted at first, then followed, ears tight, breath smoking in the stillness. Behind them the hay rack dragged crookedly over the crusted snow. One runner had already split. The back corner sagged low. Every few yards the rack lurched and caught. Caleb did not curse it. Not yet. The first cut in the bluff faced west. He rejected it before stepping inside. The storm would drive straight into it and turn it into a chimney. The second hollow was deeper, but its roof had cracked in 3 places. Fresh stone lay scattered across the floor. The third was barely more than a notch in the earth. Caleb stopped in front of it. A shallow sandstone ledge hung above the opening. 2 walls of frozen bank curved inward on either side. The back was packed tight with old earth and roots. The floor was dry. The mouth was narrow enough to close if a man was desperate enough to use what he had. Caleb stood there for one long breath. Then he looked back at the hay rack. It was not worth fixing. It had not been worth much when he started. A freight man at the rail siding had laughed when Caleb tied it together with rawhide and baling wire. "That thing won't carry you 10 miles, the man had said. He had been right, but Caleb no longer needed it to carry him. He needed it to stop the wind. The first flakes hit his coat like thrown sand. He pulled the hatchet from beneath the seat and started breaking the rack apart. The wood fought him. Cold had drawn every nail tight. The rawhide knots were frozen hard as horn. The iron straps bit at the axe blade. Caleb swung until his shoulders burned. He pried until the skin split across one knuckle. He kicked loose boards free and tore canvas from the side rail with both hands. The storm line grew wider behind him. The clean sky vanished in pieces. A low sound rolled across the basin. Too deep for thunder, too steady for an animal. Juniper threw her head up and tried to bolt. Caleb dropped the axe, grabbed the cheek strap, and held on. Easy, easy. The mule trembled. Caleb felt the fear passing through her like a current. He could not afford to lose her. Not because she could pull anymore. Because in the night ahead, her body heat might be the difference between a shelter and a grave. He cut the traces loose. The rack collapsed sideways into the snow. For one terrible moment, Caleb only stared at it. The last thing he owned that looked like a plan was now scattered boards, canvas, rope, and cracked runners. Then the wind returned. It came as one thin blade across the back of his neck. Caleb moved. He dragged the biggest section of the hay rack toward the notch in the bluff. It was heavier than it looked, made worse by frozen slush packed beneath the runners. The wood caught on sage roots. The rope dug through his coat and into his shoulder. Twice he fell. Once he landed hard on his chest and lay there with snow against his mouth, listening to the growing roar. He got up because the roar was closer. At the notch, he shoved the rack section across the opening. Too wide. He tipped it, cursed under his breath, kicked away frozen earth, and tried again. This time the broken frame wedged beneath the sandstone lip at an angle, leaving only a low entrance at the side. It was ugly. It leaned. The top corner scraped the ledge. There were gaps everywhere, but it changed the shape of the wind. Caleb could feel it at once. Outside, the first gusts started running across the basin. Inside the notch, the air moved less. Not stopped, less. Less was not enough. Years before, when Caleb was 16, an old sheepherder named Mateo had taught him how men died in open weather. Mateo had held a lantern near a crack in a bunkhouse wall. The flame bent sideways. Then he pressed a strip of wool into the crack, and the flame stood tall again. Cold is patient, Mateo told him. Wind is greedy. It takes heat as fast as you give it. Caleb remembered the flame. Now he searched for every place the greedy thing could enter. He pulled canvas over the high gaps and pinned it with stones. He jammed sagebrush into the side seams. He stuffed torn oat sacks into the spaces between boards. He packed snow against the outer base, then slapped frozen mud over it where the snow would not hold. A blast hit before he finished. The hay rack slammed inward. The canvas snapped like a gunshot. One stone rolled loose and struck Caleb's boot. Snow burst through the upper seam, hard and white, filling the notch with needles. Juniper brayed and backed into the rear wall. Caleb lunged for the flapping canvas. The wind tore at it with both hands. For 3 seconds, the whole shelter seemed to breathe in and out. If the rack lifted, the notch would open. If the notch opened, there would be no second chance. Caleb wrapped the loose canvas around a broken side rail and pulled until his injured hand went numb. The canvas held barely. He kept working. The light disappeared, not faded. Disappeared. The basin outside became a white, moving dark. Snow flew sideways, so thick Caleb could no longer see the trail he had left only minutes earlier. The roar filled the notch and shook in his teeth. Then he found the worst gap. It was low on the right side where the rack frame did not meet the frozen bank. Barely 3 fingers wide, easy to miss, deadly enough to matter. Air shot through it in a clean stream. Caleb put his face near it and felt the knife of it across his cheek. That one gap would drain the whole hollow by midnight. He clawed at the frozen ground for mud. The earth would not give. He struck it with the back of the hatchet, breaking off chunks, then crushed them in his hands with snow and straw until he had something he could pack. His fingers bled again. He did not stop. Mud, straw, canvas scrap, more mud, more snow against the outside. The stream weakened. He pressed his palm over the seam. Nothing, Not warmth, not comfort, only stillness. Inside that stillness, his hope returned so quietly he almost missed it. He turned to Juniper. The mule stood half inside, half out, blocked by fear and the shaking wall. Caleb stepped close, lowered his voice, and put his forehead against hers. "You stopped us," he said. "Now come in." The next gust struck the shelter broadside. Juniper lurched forward instead of back. Caleb guided her into the notch, then pulled the last board section across the low entrance. He folded the remaining canvas over the side gap and wedged a runner through it like a bar. A saddle blanket went along the bottom. The empty oat sacks filled the corners. Snow packed outside the threshold. When he finally sat down, there was no room to stretch his legs. Juniper's flank pressed near his shoulder. The sandstone wall was cold against his back. The floor bit through his coat. The smell of mule, wet leather, old oats, and frozen earth filled the dark. It was not a cabin. It was not safe. It was only closed. Then the blizzard arrived in full. The impact sounded like a river of stones hitting the world at once. The hay rack bowed inward. Canvas hammered above him. Snow hissed through tiny faults in the seams, not as drifts, but as dust, finding every weakness Caleb had left behind. He crawled in the dark, feeling with bare fingers for movement of air. He found one leak near the top and stuffed it with wool from his coat lining. He found another behind his boot and sealed it with a torn strip from the oat sack. Each repair was small. Each one mattered. The storm wanted a door. Caleb gave it none. Hour after hour, the blizzard leaned against the notch. The sound changed as snow piled higher outside. At first, the wind slapped the rack directly. Later, it thudded against the growing drift. Later still, the roar became muffled, as if the shelter had sunk under a thick blanket. That was when Caleb understood the second mercy. The same snow that could bury a man alive was now burying the seams. The drift climbed over the base, then the side, then halfway up the rack. It pressed the canvas into the gaps. It banked against the broken frame and held it tighter than Caleb ever could. Winter was trying to erase him. By erasing him, it hid him. Inside, Juniper's breathing slowed. Warm vapor rolled from her nostrils and dampened the dark. Caleb tucked his hands beneath his arms and listened to the animal breathe. He counted each breath when the cold made his thoughts wander. 1, 2, 3. Still alive. Sometime deep in the night, the storm found the high seam again. A needle of air touched Caleb's ear. He woke from a half-dream of his wife folding breadcloths in their old kitchen. For a moment he did not know where he was. Then the cold line moved across his neck, and he understood. He rose on stiff knees. His fingers could barely close. He took the last strip of rawhide from his belt, pushed it into the seam with the hatchet handle, and packed snow over the outside by reaching through the low corner blind. The wind tore at his sleeve. He held his arm there until the snow crusted around the gap. The draft died. Caleb sat back in the darkness, shaking. He almost laughed. Not because anything was funny, because the difference between death and morning had been a crack no wider than a knife handle. Near dawn, the sound changed again. The roar loosened. The steady hammering broke into uneven gusts, then into long breaths, then into silence. So complete Caleb heard melted frost drop from the canvas onto the floor. For a while he did not move. He did not trust quiet anymore. A thin blue line appeared beneath the upper edge of the rack. Morning, Caleb pushed at the entrance. Nothing moved. Snow had sealed them in. He dug with a hatchet, then with a board, then with his hands. Packed snow fell inward in hard slabs. Cold air poured through the hole, but it no longer cut. It drifted in gently, almost politely, as if the world had forgotten what it had done in the night. Caleb crawled out first. He stood in sunlight up to his thighs. The trail was gone. The sage was gone. The whole basin had become smooth white country, with no tracks, no road, No sign that a man and mule had ever crossed it. Behind him, the shelter was almost invisible. Only one corner of the broken hay rack showed through the drift. Juniper pushed out after him, shaking snow from her ears. Caleb put one hand on her neck and looked back at what had saved them. Not the rack, not the bluff, not the canvas. All of it together. Boards nobody trusted. A notch nobody would notice. Mud packed by bleeding hands. Snow that became a wall because the wind had been denied a way through. Caleb stayed there longer than he needed to. Then he led Juniper south by the shape of the sun. 2 days later, he reached his brother's sheep camp alive. The men there listened to the story in silence. They had been searching the lower trail for him. They had found 2 abandoned freight loads and 1 dead team buried near a fence line. When Caleb finished, his brother stared at the cracked canvas still tied to the rack runner and asked the only question that mattered. How did that hold? Caleb looked toward Juniper, standing warm and stubborn beside the shed. Then he answered, "It didn't hold back winter." He paused. "It only kept winter from getting inside." Years later, when the story was told around sheep, camp stoves, and depot rooms, people always remembered the mule that stopped in the white road. But Caleb remembered the gap, the little place where the wind had tried to enter, the place small enough for most men to ignore, because that was where the night had turned. Not in a brave charge through the storm, not in a miracle rescue, not in strength. In a broken rack wedged into a cut of earth, packed shut by a man who understood one thing before the blizzard, understood him. The storm could take the road, it could take the sky, it could bury every track he had made, but all night long it kept searching for a doorway, and it never found one.